Welcome to Pasta. We're going to talk about pasta and the sauces we typically pair with pasta. We'll also talk briefly about some other food science topics such as organic foods and genetically modified organisms that we see discussed in a variety of non-scientific forums, and as a result there's a lot of misinformation regarding these topics. Let's get started. Pasta is the Italian word for paste or dough, and pasta is simply wheat flour combined with water to make a clay-like mass that we then form into small pieces and boil. Because of its clay-like texture, we can form the pasta into a wide variety of different shapes, of which some are shown on the left. The word noodle comes from the German word for pasta and is typically used to refer to pasta-like foods that aren't made in the Italian tradition. Now, I'm going to use the term pasta to refer to foods that derive from Italy and the term noodle to refer to foods that derive mostly from China, simply to make it easy to tell the origins of the foods I'm discussing. But you should recognize that this is largely an arbitrary distinction, and both types of foods can appropriately be referred to as either a pasta or a noodle. The Italian and Chinese cultures have both developed a wide variety of pasta and noodle dishes. In Italy, the high gluten durum wheat led to a sturdy, protein rich pasta that can be dried and stored indefinitely, manufactured industrially, and formed into hundreds of different shapes. The high gluten durum wheat didn't grow natively in China, however, and the low gluten wheat that did led to the development of relatively long noodles and thin wrappers that were prepared fresh and largely by hand. Most of the noodle dishes were served in a thin broth, largely because the weaker structure from the lower gluten content of the wheat meant that the noodles were more likely to fall apart, so more lubrication in the form of broth was necessary. The low gluten content of the wheat that grew in China also meant that wheat flour wasn't clearly superior to flour from other plants, as was the case in Italy. As a result, Chinese cooks discovered ways to make noodles from a wide variety of other grains in addition to wheat. Examples include noodles made from rice, acorns, seaweed, and beans. The key to making a good pasta dough is to turn the dry flour into a dough that is malleable enough to shape into thin strips while also being strong enough to stay together when boiled. Just like in breads, the gluten proteins from the wheat form the majority of the structure of the pasta. The durum wheat is high in gluten, but it's less elastic than bread wheat gluten, so it's easier to roll out into thin sheets without the elasticity pulling the dough back together after being stretched. The pasta dough also contains around 30% water compared to around 40% water for most breads. Furthermore, pasta dough isn't leavened like bread dough is. The combination of these two means that the gluten network is quite strong, as it's not broken up by gas bubbles or diluted somewhat by water. To make pasta, the ingredients are mixed and briefly kneaded, then the dough is allowed to rest to give time for the flour particles to absorb water and for the gluten network to begin to develop. Over time, the dough becomes easier to work. The dough is rolled repeatedly into a thinner and thinner sheet. This repeated rolling presses out any air bubbles that would weaken the gluten structure and also serves to align the gluten proteins as we saw with kneading bread. The rolling process differs from the kneading process in that the rolling also spreads out the gluten proteins rather than just stretching them, and so the resulting dough is less elastic. Often, the pasta is allowed to dry and can be stored for long periods of time. Whether cooked fresh or after drying, the pasta is boiled in water, causing the gluten protein network and the starch granules to absorb water and expand. This expansion of starch granules ruptures the outer layer of the granule, and some of the starch dissolves into the water. You can see this as a cloudiness in the water, as shown here. Deeper in the interior of the pasta, there is less water, so the starch granules expand but don't burst free of the protein network. Thus, the outside of the noodle becomes very soft while the inside retains more of the structure and is flexible but still somewhat stiff. We typically cook pasta al dente, which means to the teeth. That is, we typically want the interior of the noodle to be still somewhat chewy. At this point, the outer layer is 80 to 90% water, while the interior is only 40 to 60% water. If we continue to boil the pasta, however, water will eventually diffuse into the interior and the entire noodle will become overly soft and mushy to the point where it will begin to break apart when you try to pick it up with a fork. The typical advice is that pasta should generally be cooked in 10 or more times its weight in water at a vigorous boil. This provides enough water to be absorbed while still leaving plenty of water for the dissolving starch to be diluted into. If too little water is used, the starch in the cooking water gets too concentrated and the noodles tend to stick together. However, if you stir the noodles reasonably frequently, the noodles sticking together ceases to be much of a concern. As a result, you can cook pasta in just enough water to cover it, and it will cook significantly faster as you'll only have to heat a small amount of water rather than an entire potful. If you do so, you should, however, rinse the noodles after draining to ensure the removal of any dissolved starches, or the noodles will stick together once they dry out a little bit. Again, noodles have a tendency to stick together when they sit next to each other just after being added to hot water. The outer layer of the noodles absorbs the small amount of water between noodles, and the starch gelates between the noodles, holding them together. To avoid this stickiness, you can either stir continuously for the first few minutes after adding pasta to the water, that is, until the outer layer of the noodle is hydrated, or you can use oil to lubricate the noodles. To do so, add a small amount of oil to the water, then pull the pasta up through the oil to lubricate the surfaces of the noodles and prevent the gelation between adjacent noodles. However, coating the noodles with oil in this way will cause water-based sauces to no longer adhere to the noodles. That is, if your spaghetti is coated in oil, your marinara sauce will no longer coat the noodles and stick to them. Adding salt to the cooking water limits the starch gelation, reducing the starch lost to the cooking water and reducing the stickiness of the noodles. Note, however, that the amount of salt necessary is far higher than what most people add. As a result, the addition of salt will typically have a negligible impact for most cooks. But even if your noodles don't stick together while cooking, they can still stick together after being removed from the water. This stickiness that develops after cooking is caused by the starch granules on the surface of the noodle drying out. This effect can be minimized by rinsing the drained noodles to remove some of the surface starch, or by wetting them with some sauce, cool water, oil, or some butter. Okay, let's now turn to sauces. Here, we're going to discuss sauces in general, not just sauces that we might add to pasta, such as marinara or Alfredo. Some of the sauces we eat are made by simply crushing or pureeing fruits or vegetables. Examples of these simple sauces include applesauce and tomato sauce. Crushing or pureeing the plant breaks the cell walls into fragments that become suspended in the juices composed largely of liquid that was previously inside those cell walls. These fragments of cell wall thicken the juice into a sauce with a much higher viscosity. For example, applesauce flows much slower than does apple juice, and that's due to the long fragments of cell wall that have difficulty sliding past each other and so slow down the entire mixture. Similarly, we can add crushed nuts or spices to thicken a sauce. The nut or spice has little water of its own, but still plenty of cell walls. So we can effectively add these long fragments without simultaneously adding much water that would otherwise dilute the sauce. Sauces produced simply by pureeing plant material tend to produce a coarse, grainy texture. The carbohydrate and protein particles are quite large, somewhere between 0.1 and 1 millimeter, and clump together. This means that they don't bind water nearly as well as the individual carbohydrate or protein molecules would, and so the large particles of cell wall are relatively inefficient thickeners. The result is similar to the curdling of milk, in which there are clumps that are more solid, surrounded by a liquid containing water and the remainder of the molecules that tend not to clump together. These large particles also easily settle out of the mixture, creating a dense, semi-solid phase on the bottom of the sauce and a less dense, watery phase on the top. This settling process happens much faster during the cooking process as the hot water rises. Remember that molecules move faster as the temperature increases, and so the increased temperature increases the rate at which the water molecules will move through the mixture. Let's now turn to some other food science topics. We've discussed in previous videos the negative health effects of high fructose corn syrup, so all I'm going to say about that here is that the research indicates that it's probably a good idea to minimize how much you consume. But we also know that diets high in sugar, whether sucrose, glucose, or fructose, also appear to cause significant health problems for us. After all, our bodies evolved to use sugar as an energy source, but natural sources of sugar are all at relatively low concentrations. Fruits have the highest sugar concentrations, and the fruits with the highest sugar concentrations are still only about 10 to 15% sugar. And even then, they contain many other nutritious substances. Some processed foods have far higher sugar concentrations and far lower concentrations of other beneficial substances. As a result, our bodies appear to have difficulty appropriately dealing with such high sugar foods, and if we consume too many of them, we significantly increase our likelihood for a variety of health issues, including heart disease, diabetes, and more. Another big topic in popular media is organic food. Many consumers assume that organic food is healthier than food not labeled as organic. However, the distinction the US government uses regarding whether a food can be labeled organic is whether or not man made substances have been applied to the field in the previous 3 years. This does not prevent the farmer from using pesticides or herbicides, and there is a long list of such chemicals that the farmer is allowed to use while still calling the food organic. The vast majority of organic food has in fact been sprayed with pesticides. It's just that those pesticides are generally not man made. That is, they're either dug out of the ground, such as with a variety of copper compounds, hydrogen peroxide, or diatomaceous earth, or they're produced by other living things, such as with a variety of plant oils or a few different species of bacteria. As a chemist, I'll be the first to admit that some man made pesticides pose significant health risks. But some of these organic pesticides also have been shown to pose serious risks. So the idea that organic food is healthier than non organic food is far more complicated than many organic farmers would like to admit. Now, I'm not saying you should not consume organic foods, as the choice is entirely yours. I'm simply cautioning you to be aware of the farming practices of those who you obtain your food from and educate yourself on the health and environmental risks posed by those farming practices. Another similar topic is that of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. So, what does it mean for a food to be GMO? A food that's labeled as GMO obviously has had its genetic code modified by humans. That is, the DNA of the organism has been changed in a lab. Typically, this involves taking a portion of DNA from an organism that has desirable traits and implanting that DNA into an existing strand of DNA in another organism. For example, alfalfa plants have been modified to be able to tolerate the herbicide Roundup. This means that an alfalfa farmer can spray Roundup on the field, killing off all non-resistant plants like weeds, resulting in higher yields of the crop alfalfa per acre. So do these genetic modifications pose risks to humans? Are GMO foods dangerous to eat? The truth is that, like any actions humans take, there's always the possibility for unintended consequences. Bacteria are well known for their ability to swap portions of their DNA with other nearby cells, so it's certainly possible for these genes to be swapped out of the GMO crops and enter other organisms. In a small number of cases, such DNA transfers might cause some problems, either by making it easier for the new organism to thrive in the presence of Roundup, thus making it more difficult to get rid of the organism, or more difficult for the new organism to thrive, thus making it more difficult to cultivate. But as I just said, these processes that alter DNA occur naturally. The scientists in the lab have simply sped up the process. Furthermore, the vast majority of the food that we eat that isn't genetically modified by scientists in laboratories has still been significantly modified by humans. That is, humans have been using selective breeding for thousands of years to change all manner of organisms. Perhaps the most illustrative of all species is the dog. Dogs started out as wolves, and those wolves that were slightly less afraid of humans learned that we'd throw them some scraps of food in exchange for the wolves acting as lookouts for our settlements. Eventually, we bred the wolves for specific traits to the point that we now have tiny dogs like Chihuahuas and massive dogs like Mastiffs. These are organisms that have been genetically modified by humans to have certain traits, and that genetic modification has both good and bad aspects. We have dogs that can perform a wide variety of different jobs, but we also have some breeds that are highly susceptible to certain health conditions. Likewise, we have modified almost all of the foods that we eat to be easier to grow, more nutritious, larger, more tasty, or any of a number of other properties that we sought to change. Again, I'm not telling you whether or not you should consume GMO foods, rather I want you to understand that as with any choice, there are positives and negatives to either option, and you should make an informed decision for yourself.